Hello, my name is Emanuele Bardone and I'm the director of the Master's Program in Educational Technology at the University of Tartu in Estonia. In this video, I'm going to provide what I called a walkthrough about webinars. I think that during the recent lockdown, we have all experienced the importance of getting in touch with students and keeping contact with them in spite of not being physically present to one another. And webinars have turned out to be a very important tool to achieve this very important pedagogical goal. Let me start from what a webinar is. Well, the first thing that I would say is that a webinar is not a tool. A webinar is something that we actually do. It's a practice, in other words. It's something that we practice. In this regard, it's also very important to notice that we cannot equate a webinar with the tool that we actually use in order to have a webinar. This is also to say that during this presentation, I will mostly refer to Zoom as the webinar tool that I use. That doesn't mean, though, that Zoom is the only tool that we can use to have good webinars. You can use Skype, Microsoft Teams, BigBlueButton, Jitsi, whatever tool you're comfortable with. We can run an analogy in this case. It's a little bit like taking pictures. I bet that you all have your own favorite camera, but that doesn't mean that in order to take good pictures you need to have a specific model, whether it's Nikon, Canon or Fuji, it doesn't matter. Taking picture is what we do, not just the tool that we use. And this is exactly what happens with webinars. And that's why in this walkthrough, I will keep going back and forth from the equipment that I use, but also the kind of practice I try to engage the students in. Before I start describing how I usually use webinars in my own teaching practice, I must try to address one big issue, which unfortunately I don't have the time to get into. The reason why I'm using webinars is because webinars, unlike other tools, or perhaps more than other tools, allow us to be present to one another. Presence is actually the biggest issue in all teaching and learning activities. If we are not present to one another, teaching and learning cannot really happen, especially when we think that teaching and learning are actually relying on a relationship, the relationship between, let's say, a teacher or a mentor or a facilitator and a student or a group of students. Presence is what allows us to discuss, to converse, to explain, to clarify, and also to understand each other. Of course, we can have the sense of being present to another in other format. We can use messages, we can have a forum conversations, but I think that it's specifically during webinars that we can have a sense that, we are not distant. Why is it that webinars give us this sense of presence? Well, one reason is that usually we have to schedule a webinar. We have to decide, agree upon a specific time slot, and then we literally come together to a virtual room. This is the very first fact. The other thing is that we can actually use both audio and video to show ourselves. And this is, as we are going to see, a very important element to bring about the sense of being present to one another. In this presentation, I will try to address a number of issues, the first of which is the kind of setup that I'm using when I'm having webinars. But I'll be also talking about whether we have to force our students to turn their webcam on. I will also be talking about some of the features that particularly Zoom provides. I'll be talking about the different type of views that we can have. I'll be talking about screen sharing. And then I will also try to get into what we can actually tell our students, how we can tell them what we can tell them when it comes to how to use a webinar tool. This is actually very important because it's vastly overlooked. Usually we expect the students know how to use a webinar tool, but it's not always the case, especially because tools such as Zoom provide many different perspectives, many different features that can be fully exploited during a webinar. In the very last part, I will be also talking about recording webinars and the significance that this can have in a course. But let's start from the very first issue, which is my own setup. How I arrange all the pieces of equipment that I have when I have a webinar: cameras, webcams, and screens. Now, in order to fully understand why we need to take care of our setup as if we were some kind of musicians that have instruments to play music, I would like to talk about something that has become known in the last few months as the talking to a screen syndrome. I think that we all had the experience of alienation during, for example, an online meeting, not talking about when we're actually teaching. Well, essentially what we do during an online meeting, and more specifically during a webinar, is that we are talking to a screen. This can actually produce a number of issues, including lack of contact, lack of feedback. In other words, it's way harder to, for example, understand what is going on the other side of the screen. What I'm talking about is this sense of lack of interpersonal contact that we have when we literally are talking to a screen. Now, even though this is not so easy to overcome, there are a few tricks that might be actually working and that might give us the sense that after all we are actually talking to another person and we're not just interacting with the blank screen. But in order to do so, we have to take care of a few things that I'm going to describe in a few seconds. Before I describe how I actually organize my desk when I'm having a webinar, I have to refer to one specific feature that Zoom actually provides. The particular Zoom feature that I'm talking about is called Dual Monitor. This allows us basically to have what you see in the picture. For example, very often I share my screen because, for example, I want to share something with my students. Now, if you use only one monitor, what is going to happen is that everything will be packed up on one single screen. For example, students virtually disappears, you cannot see them, and the only thing that you can see is your screen. And this is where usually I have the talking to a syndrome, the talking to a screen syndrome. In other words, I just have my monitor and I can do anything but just talking to my screen. Whereas with the addition of a second monitor, what happens is that, first of all, I can see all my students or the people I'm talking to. I see their reaction. This is a fundamental source of video feedback. I can see whether they are listening, whether they are not listening, whether I'm effective, whether I'm engaging or not. This is another type of setup. This is not from my own practice, but from a colleague's. So in this case, you see that we don't actually have 3 monitors, but we have 2 monitors. But essentially, it's the same thing. Having 2 monitors adds this possibility to have a little bit more interaction, and also, in case you share your screen, to keep monitoring on what is going on the other side. From time to time, I have also used other settings. We still have with the same lecture. In this case, she's using an external projector. The external projector, in my experience, added a little bit more because, first of all, you really have a big screen. You can accommodate on one big screen many more students. And once again, it gives you the feeling that you are controlling, or better, that you are in control of what is happening on the other side of Zoom. So as you can see here, you have your own laptop and you are sitting in front of the screen projected onto the wall. I would also like to talk about the kind of interaction that the video feed can provide you with. And probably I should start from the image that we try to put across. One important thing to me is to have a good webcam. Especially during the lockdown, I had many meetings and also webinars in which either students or other colleagues of mine were using the integrated webcam. In other words, the webcam that is integrated in your own laptop. And sadly to say, in many cases there were many issues. The first issue is that when you use the integrated camera, very often you tilt your laptop screen in a way that the only thing that you're going to show to the other persons is basically the ceiling of your room. So basically half of you is cut off from the image. This is not actually good because we're actually supposed to show the whole figure. Other problems are related to the light. As you can see here, I wouldn't really suggest you to sit behind a source of light. That can be, for example, a window. Your webcam will not manage so well the light. And sometimes it also happens that there is a very strong of light, as I said again, a window either on your right or on your left, and this creates not a nice effect. The best way is to be aware of the image that we send across the internet. And the best way is essentially to have our own face displayed. In jargon, I would say that it shouldn't be a close-up, but at least some kind of medium shot in which we show our shoulders and our face. And since we are talking about the image that we put across, it's important to talk about what kind of equipment we should use, starting from the webcam itself. Now, what I usually don't recommend is to use the integrated camera. And the problem is that we're not as free as when we use an external camera that can be virtually positioned wherever we want. Another piece of equipment that I usually suggest is a tripod on which we can mount the webcam. Usually a tripod can cost in between 24 and 35 euros, so it's worth the money indeed. With the external webcam, we also avoid the problem that I mentioned before. Very often, with the integrated camera, we are putting the camera in a weird position because we are actually looking at the screen. And since we're looking at our screen, what happens is that, well, we show our ceiling, which, as I said, is not the best way to convey our image to the other side of Zoom. There is also another possibility that, technically speaking, is a little bit more advanced, which is, in case you have one, is to use your photo camera. The advantage of the photo camera is basically related to quality. As you can imagine, the photo camera is a better camera than a webcam, and it allows for a clearer image. There are also issues related to the way in which lights are managed. Usually a photo camera has many more light sensors, which means that essentially even in a room that is poorly lighted, you can still show yourself. Indeed, I would never suggest you to buy a photo camera if you don't have one, but in case you have a photo camera, you may actually think of that. Another piece of equipment that you may want to consider is a tool or a piece of software to handle different video sources. In other words, what is technically called the video feed. Usually this is your webcam. which means, in other words, at the beginning of a webinar or an online meeting, you are supposed to select your video source. Usually it's the webcam. But in case you use a tool like OBS or Manicam, you can actually have the chance to handle several different video sources. You can, for instance, stream your webcam, but also your desktop, a dock camera, a YouTube video, a portion of your screen, and so on and so forth. So essentially what tools such as Manicams or OBS do is to manipulate different video sources. Now, another very important thing to consider when we're having a webinar is the way in which we want the people on the other side of Zoom to be displayed. Now, what virtually all webinar tools provide you with are two basic views, the so-called speaker view and the gallery view, as you can see in this picture. Now, whether you are sharing the screen or not, you can opt for two types of views. The speaker view is essentially the one in which the person that is displayed on the screen is the person who is actually speaking, and that's why it's called the speaker's view. The other view is called gallery view because, unlike the speaker view, basically all the people that are present in the webinar are displayed, whether they have the webcam on or not. If they don't have the webcam on, as you may know, usually there is just their name displayed on the screen. Now, I tend to use the gallery view. The gallery view allows me to monitor the situation. Now, this is very specifically related to the kind of role that you have in a webinar. If you are the person responsible, the discussant, the moderator, the facilitator, or the teacher, it's actually very important that you actually have this view, this type of view. This gallery view allows you basically to see at a glance what is going on the other side. You can easily have an overview of what is going on. If you are using a second monitor and if you have the dual monitor feature turned on, what you can actually have is to have both the speaker view and the gallery view, as you can see in this picture. So on one screen I have the gallery view and on the other I have the speaker view. This very much depends on what kind of activity you're engaged during the webinar. Because obviously, if you are talking, if you are, as it were, lecturing a crowd of people, then I would say that the gallery view is certainly the best way. You won't use the speaker view because you are actually the speaker. But in case, for example, there is a conversation, having the two views on two separate screens can be particularly helpful. The last piece of equipment that composes my own setup concerns the audio. Now, this is actually a very important aspect. I would say as important as the video feed. Essentially, what we want is to have a very good audio quality. The first thing that we want to avoid is echo. And the second is, as I said, to reach a certain level of quality. The best single piece of equipment that we must have is either earphones or even better headset. First of all, because this rules out the possibility of echo, even when Zoom has echo cancelling features built in the piece of software. The other reason is that I think that it's actually better to have earphones. We have to focus on what is going on in the virtual environment, and I think that a pair of earphones really does help. In case you want, and this is what I usually have, you can use an audio mixer. This is especially useful in case there is another person in your room, so you want to have 2 microphones, and the audio mixer accomplishes this very well. Now we come to another important feature that Zoom provides, which is the screen share. Now, Zoom is particularly interesting in this regard because there are many ways in which we can share our screen. In this case, for example, you see all the options that I have. I can, in case I'm using a second monitor, if not a third monitor, I can decide to share only what is going on in one of the 3 monitors. But I can actually share a particular kind of application or a window. What is also very interesting is that Zoom allows you to share also the sound. Sometimes it happens that just to create a nice mood, especially at the beginning of the webinar, I put some music. And in this case, I'm not actually sharing my screen, but I'm sharing the computer sound, basically the music that I'm playing in my own laptop. Zoom also provides advanced features when it comes to sharing the screen. First of all, you can you can share the content from a second camera, for example, a dock camera, or also from a tool such as an iPad, a tablet, or a phone. As far as I know, at the moment, this is only possible with Apple products. Still talking about the kind of interaction that we want to interact the students with, it's actually very important that as teachers, we understand what is going on the other side of Zoom. The importance to know what is happening on the other side of Zoom is exemplified by a question that I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is, am I sharing my screen? Or at the beginning of a webinar, can you hear me? I think that we have heard this, I don't know how many times during the lockdown. And in my own online teaching experience, this is basically my daily bread. I always start my webinar by asking the students, can you hear me? Or when I start sharing my screen, I just make sure that they can actually see what I'm seeing. Now, this actually goes much deeper than one may think of. And the reason is that, especially in the webinar, in order to have the sense of being present, we need to have some kind of feedback system that allows us to have, let's say, clues as to what is going on the other side. Obviously, the most important topic that we have to address with students when it comes to webinars is to agree whether we need to have some kind of policy concerning whether to keep the webcam on all the time or off. When I started my online teaching practice, I had a deal with students. And the deal was, dear students, I'm recording all my webinars. In case you cannot be present, it's not a problem. You can view the recording. But please, in case you decide to come, first of all, find a quiet corner, either in a cafe, in your house, in your apartment, and please keep the webcam on for the entire duration of the webinar. It's not that I force them to have the webcam on, but I think that there are pedagogical reasons even to force them to have the webcam on. I'm not actually talking about controlling that they are listening, but the webcam, or in other words, their video feed, is the fundamental, if not the only way to get some kind of feedback. In other words, clues as to what is going on the other side of the Zoom. So, for example, if I'm explaining something during a webinar or I want to make a point, I constantly look at whether the students are following me or not. In other words, if I'm understandable or if what I'm saying is just confusing them. And their facial expressions are the major source through which I can understand whether they are following me or not. And that's why I'm saying that pedagogically speaking, we have reasons to force them to have webcam on. Of course, during the lockdown, we usually had webinars at home with the family, children, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, parents, dogs, cats, and that might have produced very awkward situations during which some students might have felt that maybe it was better to turn off the camera. But generally, if we are engaged in some sort of teaching or learning activity, I think that it's very important to be in a situation in which we can keep the webcam on for the entire duration of the webinar. There are also additional features that we may want the students to know about, which is again related to the type of views that students have at their disposal. What is particularly useful in Zoom is this side-by-side mode, which basically allows us to enlarge or shrink one of the two views. So, for example, if we are listening to a presentation, we may want to have the PowerPoint that is shared bigger and the gallery view smaller. Or, in some other cases, we want to have the other way around. So we want to have the PowerPoint smaller and the gallery view bigger, or the speaker view. This simple feature allows you to switch back and forth from the two options. Incidentally, it's also very important to notice one thing, that when somebody is speaking, it's natural to be wanting to look at the person that is speaking. So in case the other person is sharing her screen, it might be that nothing is actually happening on the screen, and that's why we want to go back to her own face. In this case, we can actually see and have direct access to the person that is speaking, and this in a way facilitates our own understanding. Another important feature that is provided by Zoom is to pin a video to one of the monitors that you have. Let's imagine the following situation. Let's say that there is a presentation that is delivered by two students or two teachers. And let's say that you have two screens. Under this particular kind of scenario, you can actually pin one speaker to one screen and the other to the other screen. In this way, you create, or let's say you compensate on the lack of interaction that you would normally have when being physically present in the same room. As you can imagine, what we usually do when we are present in a seminar room is just to switch to one person to the other. Now, of course, in a virtual environment, this is not possible. We can, though, compensate, as I said, on the lack of this possibility. And one way is to pin different videos to different monitors. Another important feature that Zoom allows to do is to mute the mic. Actually, this is something that virtually all webinar tools allow you to do. Now, this is still about the kind of interaction that you want to establish during a webinar, and more specifically, it's still about the compensatory nature of many of the features that I've been discussing. Usually, when I have a webinar with a small group, let's say up to 10 persons, I don't ask the participants to mute their mic. This is again to avoid the syndrome related to talking to a screen. What happens, in fact, is that if you don't mute your mic, you can hear other people breathing, which is actually something nice because it means that you're not alone. Or in case a person wants to interject, this can be easily done without, for example, stumble upon the mistake to start to speak with the microphone still off. But if you decide to ask the participants to mute their mic, there's still a chance to unmute your mic very quickly by hold down the space bar when you want to be unmuted and talk. This is another thing that we want the students to know, because in case they have their mic mute, or if they want to do so, they may want to know that instead of going with the mouse over the little mic icon, they can just hold down the space bar and they are automatically unmuted. Now, the very last feature that I would like to talk about are breakout rooms. As I said, one of the biggest problems with online meetings and also webinars is that there's basically no group dynamics. Students are very rarely, if never, interacting with one another, except when there is a discussion or a conversation. Breakout rooms obviously allow the host or the moderator of the webinar to create or to compensate on the lack of group dynamics. For example, the fact that students cannot actually talk to the person sitting next to him or her. Now, the problem that I've seen with breakout rooms is that unfortunately students cannot create their own breakout rooms. Only the host has the capacity, first, to create breakout rooms, and secondly, students cannot choose with whom they want to be. To my knowledge, there are no other webinar tools that can provide this. That would be a very important feature. Indeed, one thing that teachers can use for creating the sense of group dynamics is the chat. I'm not a big fan of the chat, and yet this is something that you can still use in order to give the chance to students to talk to one another. Unfortunately, what Zoom provides with is either to talk to the whole group, to chat to the whole group, or to a specific person. The last feature that I would like to talk about is recording the webinar. Zoom actually provides you with several opportunities that I would like to talk about in this very last part of this video. Before I do that, perhaps we should try to understand why we want to record the webinar. What is the reason why this might be a valuable option? One obvious reason is that if somebody misses a webinar, he or she can watch it at a later point in time. This is particularly useful in case you're teaching to a crowd of people that are usually working. So, for example, the students from our master's program are all educational practitioners, and what happens is that they may actually miss some of my webinars, and if I record the webinars, well, this is again compensating on the fact that they cannot attend live. But what I usually say is that be part of a webinar is not the same thing as watching a webinar. The reason is that, of course, the webinars are actually supposed to provide some sort of interactions, to have a chance to be present with your students. And that's why it's actually very important to be present. Now, I would like to talk about a few features that Zoom in particular provides with. The first thing is that Zoom allows you to record the webinar either to your computer, so that you will have an MP4 automatically generated at the end of the webinar, or in case you actually pay, you can have the chance to record the webinar to the cloud. Basically what Zoom does, and this is a very important feature, is to have separate recordings of either the gallery view, the active speaker, the shared screen, and in post-production you can actually edit all these files. One interesting thing that Zoom provides is also the audio file of the entire recording, which can actually be used in case you want to give the students the chance just to listen to the webinar. This is, I would say, particularly useful in case during the webinar nobody shared any visuals. So it was just a conversation. Now, this is pretty much it. You may actually be wondering now that I didn't actually define what a webinar is. Well, okay, I just said that a webinar is essentially a seminar that is happening over the internet. But what is exactly a webinar, and what is it for? How it can be used, for example, in an online course or as part of your online teaching activities? Well, these are questions that I purposefully leave open. There are actually, in my opinion, many answers. There are many reasons why we may want to use a webinar, one of which I said is related to be present to one another. But it very much depends on the context and the particular kind of teaching practice you're involved in. Whether, for example, you are teaching young students or adults. Whether you're using webinars to discuss some sort of materials, or if you decide to use webinars as moments in which to get together and